Hey, I'm Angus Stewart, and you're listening to the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. Just something I wanted to say before we kick off episode 5. I think that in previous episodes there was a point I fumbled slightly, where I was trying to express my feeling that how Western readers, or a particular section of Western readers, or perhaps Westerners in general, when it comes to literature from parts of the world that are less Western, liberal, capitalist, democratic than they are, they expect that every author is going to be in rebellion mode, talking about how awful and how awful things are, how oppressed they are. And, you know, it's hard for me to properly get that point across because I'm not someone from that part of the world. So I'd just like to give you the words of a Chinese poet who I think said it better than I did. So the quote starts here. Wherever people praise our ancient art, yet insist that the Chinese today should only write political poetry, in their imagination aside from the bloodshed, we do not deserve to seek beauty like artists before us. Nor do we have the right to indulge in the mundane and song, in sharp spasms of morality. In the endless folds of history, a life's touch becomes estranged from itself and is reduced to footnotes about hardships and inhumane colonies. So those were 2 stanzas from the poem Florence by the Chinese poet Zhu Zhu. And yeah, everything I wanted to say about that little niggly point, he said much better, and he's actually Chinese. I'm just a Scottish guy. That's why we read translated fiction, to get perspectives that, you know, we wouldn't have access to unless someone translated them. That's why it's called translated fiction. Anyway, as you may have guessed, we're looking at the poet Zhu Zhu today, his newly published collection of poetry, The Wild Great Wall, translated by an awesome guy called Dong Li. So here we go. So before we launch right in, I've got a few plugs to do. First one's this podcast's Instagram account. It's TRCHFIC. So that's the place where you can find out exactly what's going on up to date. You can find out what episode I'm planning next and how far through I am, the process of putting it together. The other place I'd like to point you towards is our new Patreon account, which is going to be linked in the show notes. So the reason I'm launching a Patreon is because with the launch of this podcast, we're going to have gone over the maximum free number of minutes that SoundCloud allows for audio uploads. After this, I'm going to have to start paying a subscription to keep putting up episodes up on the SoundCloud servers. So if you enjoy the show and you can afford it, it would be fantastic if you could contribute. The way Patreon works, it's a monthly donation or a monthly contribution. I'm going to probably open up a PayPal too to allow for people to give one-off contributions. But in the meantime, through the Patreon, if you can contribute $2 per month, I'll give you a shout out at least once. If you want a monthly shout out, I think that's fair. If you want a shout out per show, well, there's none so far, so there's no one in a queue fighting for shout outs. If you can contribute 20 USD, you can just dictate what book I talk about. You can tell me a translated Chinese work of literature. I will make an episode about it. Obviously, if a ton of people jump on that, I might have to retract that offer or dial it back or make it more expensive. But I'm not expecting it to be a hot ticket. So anyway, at least the first few people who stick in 20 USD on Patreon, bang, you have an episode that you've dictated. Guaranteed. The first few, although, few is not a strict legal term. So I reserve all rights to be stingy. So there's my plugs. What you can expect later on in this episode, which I'll just plug now so that I keep you listening throughout, is that we've got an interview. I did a wee talk with Yesenia of Phony Media, which are the publishing house who published our book for today, The Wild Great Wall, Zhu Zhu's collection of poetry. So keep listening all the way through, and you can hear me chatting with Yesenia. Disclaimer, I come across as really quite awkward for the first few minutes, and then... No, actually not just the first few minutes, all the way throughout, I'm an awkward fool, but you already know that if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, so don't worry about that. So who are Phony Media? Well, in the PDF proof copy of the Wild Great Wall, this is what their copyright page had to say. It said, Phony Media is a non-profit media company dedicated to promoting cross-cultural understanding, connecting people and ideas through translated books and films. I think translated books are more their forte just now. They've got a whole catalogue of books with exclusively stunning modern cover designs. Honestly, if you have any reason to go to Phony Media's website, just have a look at their list of books, have a look at the cover designs. They're gorgeous. So is The Wild Great Wall the first Chinese book on Phony Media's list? Well, the answer is yes and perhaps no. It's certainly the first book translated from any variation of the Chinese language, but they do have a book very early on in their list called Uyghurland, the Furthest Exile. So if you're a China watcher like me, you'll know who the Uyghurs are. If not, here's a very quick explanation. So in modern China, there is a province in its far northwest, quite a geographically large province, which its Chinese name is Xinjiang, which means New Frontier. It's a region which, through imperial China's history, fell in and out of the Chinese Empire's influence, but since, for most of the 20th century, it's belonged to the Chinese Republic, or the Chinese People's Republic. But the indigenous people there, who still make up more than half the population, at least the largest indigenous population there are the Uyghur people, and they are a ethnically Turkic group. So they are ethnically quite distinct from the Han Chinese and the majority of the other ethnic minorities in China. They're Turkic, so they're more Central Asian. At present, the Uyghur people of Xinjiang are, to call a spade, they're under quite a high degree of oppression from their government. So the question of whether or not we call Uyghurland a Chinese book is, whether we like it or not, a political question. But it does have an interesting thematic link, at the very least, with The Wild Great Wall, because in the subtitle of Uyghurland, it is the Farthest Exile, and exile is a term that pops up a lot in The Wild Great Wall. Now, quite a lot of Chinese authors who do get international fame do end up being exiles because they're in danger if they continue to stay in China. So they go abroad, often to Western countries or to perhaps Taiwan. Our author today, Zhu Zhu, he is still living in China, but on the topic of, or in the theme of exile, let's have a wee look at our word of a day, or word of the episode, a new little feature I've come up with for this show. So for this episode, I looked up the word exile in my Chinese dictionary, and it's liu wang, and so that's the verb. To exile is liu wang someone, to exile someone. The noun, as far as I could tell, is liu wang zhi. So if I exile you, if I liu wang you, then you have become a liu wang zhi. You have become an exile. So basically adding zhi makes it a noun, and that struck me as interesting because liu wang, of course it rhymes with that word we used before in our previous episodes on Wang Shuo and Murang Shui Sun, liu mang, hooligan, and it is the same Leo, that same character Leo. So I haven't gone in depth and checked out the connotations and full kind of scope of meaning of the character Leo, but that struck me as interesting. Exile is Liu Wang, hooligan Liu Mang. So the question we want to maybe ask ourselves here is, Zhu Zhu, the author of The Wild Great Wall, is he really a Liu Wang? Is he really an exile? So when I went looking for this kind of answers to this question online, there is an article on the website of the organization World Literature Today, which was written by Zhu Zhu's translator, Dong Li, who translated The Wild Great Wall into English. And Dong Li describes Zhu Zhu as a lone wolf utterly on the periphery. So I went digging around to see, how much of a lone wolf, how much of a guy on the periphery is Zhu Zhu. And what I could gather was that he's not banned from residence in China. He's living in Beijing these days. And he's, in the Western world, he's like a widely awarded author. I think he has had some prizes in China too. But the main chunk of information I was able to get was, perhaps tellingly, the same wee author bio over and over again on different websites that hosted his poetry. So it exists in various different versions with minute differences, but here's a fairly generic version of Zhu Zhu's author's mini bio that I could find. So it starts now. Zhu Zhu was born in Yangzhou in the People's Republic of China. He's the author of numerous books of poetry, essays, and art criticism, including a bilingual French edition translated by Chantal Chen Andro. He's the recipient of the Henry Luce Foundation Chinese Poetry Fellowship at the Vermont Studio Center and the Chinese Contemporary Art Award for Critics. He was also a guest of the Rotterdam and Val de Marne International Poetry Festivals. He lives in Beijing. So a few things to note. First of all, I believe that it was at the Vermont Studio Center that Zhu Zhu and Dong Li first met each other, although they first came into contact by phone call. Other things to note. So Zhu Zhu's birthplace is listed as Yangzhou, People's Republic of China. So they've included both a local place in China, they haven't just opted to only say China, and they've opted to say People's Republic of China, not just China. So this guy who's been writing in Chinese and his writing has been translated to English is specified in a specific geographic location and in the People's Republic of China. So not just China, but the part of China, the Greater Chinese Nation, which has a communist name. I think that is an interesting point. Another thing to note is that in this mini author bio, his acclaim and connections that are mentioned are in Europe and North America. He has also had some recognition in his home country, but I think a lot of this recognition, at least as far as I can gather, has been in the English-speaking world. As far as I could tell, he is not literally exiled from China, although we should note that there have been and are Chinese artists and writers who live in tier 1 cities like Beijing and Shanghai who are perhaps at risk of censorship or deportation or being jailed for being outspoken. But so although we might think of Beijing as being the hub of power, in the cultural realm, it is quite a liberal city by Chinese standards. It's like part of your Chinese equivalent of the American Eastern Seaboard. I don't really have any specific examples to compare to Zhu Zhu with you, but and I also don't think Zhu Zhu is the kind of, having read this book of poetry, I really don't think he's writing anything directly critical enough to really put him in danger. But just because it says he lives in Beijing, please don't go thinking that he's, totally, a mouthpiece of the status quo, because he's absolutely not. Dong Li's World Literature Today article does have a few wee clues about Zhu Zhu, who he is. So Dong Li mentions that the first time he met Zhu Zhu, as I hinted at before, was at the Vermont Studio Center. And he said that whilst they were staying together at this Vermont studio for their residencies, Dong Li noticed that Zhu Zhu was pretty kind of extroverted. He was communicating through smiles and gestures at Vermont bars. So it's not said outright, but you can maybe assume that Zhu Zhu's not a fluent English speaker. He's communicating more through like his body language, his expressions. Dong Li also mentioned he plays a lot of ping pong. Without jumping into this too far, if you've been an expatriate, if you've been an immigrant, you'll know a little bit how this is. So yeah, good on Zhu Zhu for getting out to the bars anyway and not staying in his home when he was in Vermont. That's pretty awesome. So here's a wee quote from the Dong Li article. Here is a fearlessly independent poet who maintains his cool and observes the world with his whole eyes as the political horizon blurs and shifts. What matters to him is how words silently explode and become explosives, and how language sinks and rises. So there's again this emphasis on putting the beauty and sound and feel of your poetry before political imperatives and narratives, especially since how do you maintain your integrity and kind of a consistent position on things when in this day and age, politics is such a big, hazy, ever-shifting mess. If you really care about poetry, how much can you care about geopolitics? I think if you're a poet writing in English, you aren't expected to think about your country's rising or falling position in the globe, because your country's identity doesn't exist in opposition to others. Whereas if you're a Chinese poet, your country's entire national identity in this day and age is that of a rising identity against the dominant powers. So good on Zhu Zhu for saying, yes, I am going to use my poetry to refer back to Chinese history, Chinese culture, but as for expectations about what I should write politically in my own country and in the West, it's only important if it makes my poetry more meaningful. And otherwise, screw all expectations. Right, so now a wee bit about Dong Li, the translator of the Wild Great Wall. So he was the guy who first reached out to Zhu Zhu by telephone asking to translate his work to English. And Dong Li is now the holder of the English rights to the Wild Great Wall. That's written inside the book itself. So Dong Li was born in the People's Republic of China. I haven't learned where. That information's not available in his author bios online. Chinese, of course, is his first language, but he's trilingual, so he can translate, as far as I'm aware, to and from Chinese, English, and German. He's based in Germany right now, in Leipzig. If you look online, he's got a profile on translatorscafe.com, which says he's based in Würzburg, but I happen to know through my own powers of speaking to people online by email, i.e. Dong Li himself. He's not in Würzburg these days, he's in Leipzig. And this man, he's got a lot under his belt. He's got degrees, undergraduate and postgraduate. He has published poetry, he has published translations, he's won grants, he's won fellowships, he's held editorial positions, as far as I can tell, all in America and Germany. Those seem to be his two kind of HQs for his literary career. He may perhaps have had positions in China that aren't listed on these English language sites, but as far as I can tell, he's a great translator of Chinese to English and vice versa, based in the Western world. That's Dong Li. I'll be learning more about him when I speak to him. I'm probably going to release that interview in a kind of episode 6 bonus episode, which will just be me and him having a chat. But yes, excellent, cool man. Okay, so a wee bit on this edition of the Wild Great Wall. Of course, it's a first edition. This is a newly put together collection of Zhu Zhu's poetry. So the Wild Great Wall has a Chinese name. It's Ye Chángchéng. Chángchéng just means Great Wall. That's a commonly translated Chinese word into English. Yeah, I learned the character and apologies if I'm not doing the tone correctly, but I learned to visually recognize this character. This is just an anecdote from my own life. So the word for rabbit in Chinese is tuzi. Hare is ye tu, and tu means rabbit, ye means wild. So a hare in Chinese is just wild rabbit, but Wild Great Wall is ye Chángchéng. If you wanted to learn a little bit about how I've learned some Chinese vocab, there you go. I know the wild because I learned the word for hare because I have an obsession with rabbits. Anyway, the Wild Great Wall. It is a bilingual book. The verso, or left page, will have the Chinese words. The recto, or right page, has the words in English. And I was reading a PDF proof, so this wasn't ideal for me, because, of course, PDFs aren't laid out left page alongside the right page. It's page by page. On a laptop, on your PDF reader, that would be scrolling down, and your Kindle, that would be click by click. But anyway, I was able to tell that in print this book would be great, because you'd have the 2-page spread in front of you with both languages. So a great book for people who are, fluent in one language, learning in the other, or even, if you're an English speaker, and you've got this book, and your Chinese friend doesn't want to read the English at all, no problem, because they can read the Chinese. So that's cool. The book's cover page is entirely in English, so that would possibly be misleading. One possible room for improvement I might sneakily suggest is bilingual book covers. Although that said, Phony Media, I don't know how many of Phony Media's books are bilingual on their internal pages, but certainly all their book covers are just English. So just a wee piece of book design, publishing analysis for me there. So the internal of the book, it's structured in 4 parts. Part 1 covers, it's got, well, I'm sure it's not the entirety of Zhu Zhu's poetry, but part 1 has his poems of his written from 1990 to 1999. Part 2 has poems of his from 2000 to 2005. Part 3 has poems of his from 2006 to 2011. And Part 4 takes us from 2012 up to the present. And from what I could gather, Dong Li has kind of he's probably set those year boundaries based on what he felt were progressions in Zhu Zhu's writing. So as far as I can gather, it's not Zhu Zhu who's made these categories or these boundaries, and it's not Phony Media. This is the translator's work. It's his interpretation of Zhu Zhu's body of poetic endeavors. Yes. There is in the end matter, there's a translator's note from Dong Li. It's identical to Dong Li's World Literature Today article that I previously mentioned. What I don't know is which came first, whether Dong Li wrote the article for World Literature Today and then Phony Media popped that as a translator's note in their end matter, or whether Dong Li wrote this as a translator's note to be popped in the end, and then for publicity that was taken and used as an article for online. I don't know. I will ask Dong Li that in my interview with him. Just an interesting thing to note. There's also a list of acknowledgements in the end matter. And as a reader, that's very interesting, because that shows you where Zhu Zhu's poems have been published before. And of course, they've had a lot of success. But it's all just kind of been spread about in these small literary and poetic publications. So hopefully, with this concentrated collection of poetry, Zhu Zhu will find fame in the Western world, and perhaps the East, but certainly in the West as a poet. And hopefully Dong Li's name as a translator will be boosted and perhaps attached to Zhu Zhu for posterity. Who knows? So at this point in the show, I'd just like to read some wee excerpts of Zhu Zhu's poetry. For the record, I'm really not an expert in poetry. I'm certainly not an expert in reading it. So apologies if I'm not doing the poetry a great service. I'm also going to kind of suffix each wee excerpt with poetry with my own analysis, so I apologise for that these indulgences in advance. So the very first poem in this collection is just 3 lines, which I think is a deliberate choice. It's just a quick bite before you get the main course. So the very first poem is called Up the Stairs. Here it goes. This moment, countless men up the stairs. Upstairs, Chopin already in the dark. Downstairs, dying alone in a crowd. And something about this got me. It feels like a flavour of everything to come, because it's pulsing, it's poignant, and it's vivid and alive. And that's kind of how the rest of the poetry in this book feels. There's a reference to high Western, actually the whole book is full of references to high culture. Some Western high culture, so 20th century figures mostly, people like Chopin. And there's references to high culture in China, so the ancient classics, and also perhaps some of the 20th or 19th century greats as well. So here's another poem. This one's from, I think, the early period of Zhu Zhu's writing. I'm just going to read 2 stanzas from the poem I am Francois Villon. So right there, French name. This is a European influence. Poem starts here. Or I can teach you how to manage time with only a handful of dice and a few sprigs of parsley in the golden bowl. I can mimic the howling of a storm to rekindle the fire in the chimney, my dear uncle. It is so hot in heaven that angels' feathers slow down, yet our saliva freezes to ice at the corners of our mouths. What about a sip of wine? Long, long winter. A wolf looks for the forest of words. So if I read that properly, you should get a feel for how vivid and magical Zhu Zhu's poetry is. And you might have noticed that there's a lot of imagery there, and it seems very culturally deep. But if you stop and analyse it, there's only one image there that is culturally specific to East or West. You know, Europe or East Asia. It's the angel. As far as I'm aware, angels are purely an Abrahamic being. So you find angels in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but there's certainly no angels in Chinese or its related cultures. But everything else, you could code it as Chinese or French, Eastern or Western, or perhaps just universally human. So like dice, gambling games, golden bowls, parsley, herbs, storms, glaciers, quite elemental, quite universal, quite humanistic. Anyway, an excerpt from the poem Small Town, another one of Zhu Zhu's from this collection, and it opens with a quote from Charles Baudelaire? Yes, Baudelaire. Now, on the left page, this quote is entirely rendered in Chinese, including Charles Baudelaire's name. It's his Chinese name. On the right-hand page, it's rendered in French. I'm not going to analyse that. I'm just going to present that fact as it is and let you draw whatever conclusions you wish. Anyway, here's the excerpt from the poem. Early in the morning, before the window, I drink coffee. Before my eyes, the hotel's big garden, flowers in bloom, bushes trimmed even, beside a gravel footpath stands a statue of a half-naked goddess. Around me, soft murmurs of people talking. Their elegant manners closely resemble glassware on the table and reflective silverware. So this one, it's the start of a poem, and it starts off with a very, wealthy, elegant European vibe, which is a wee bit of a stereotype, I think, of what Chinese people felt like Europe is like it's this romantic upper-class place. They have some Chinese friends I had didn't understand that, yes, in the UK we've got quite a lot of working-class poor people. Anyway, I'm waffling. So this poem does begin with all this pleasant imagery, but it ends on strong feelings of homesickness, and the very last image in the poem, it's the image of like a peach blossom, spring peach blossom, which is, I would say, that's a fairly East Asian image, nostalgic, beautiful, and culturally specific. But it does make me feel that Zhu Zhu is, from all his time spent abroad, he's perhaps writing with reference to, nostalgia, homesickness, because just like plenty Westerners who go out to live in the East, and plenty of Chinese people who do go out to live in the West, there are, you end up torn between two places. You end up feeling homesick, and I think that's, doesn't matter which culture you're from. If you go to live somewhere else in the world, this book's going to vibe with you a bit if you're feeling homesick. If you're not totally full of hate for your homeland and the culture you've come from, which I think very few people who leave home are. There's always a part of you that wishes you were back home. Anyway, I'm definitely waffling now. Here's one stanza from the poem from the 2006 to 2011 era. The poem's called Island in the Sea. So here we go. He plants bamboo as if soldiers on the frontier, bringing in locks of lovers' hair, brews south of Yangtze in rice wine, and reads Tao Yuanming, reading him here like having a telescope push Orion out of the blue and into the heart. So this wee stanza, although it's only 4 lines, this is a great example of different kinds of cultural references that Dong Li or any translator would encounter in things they're trying to translate from one language to another. So bamboo, if you're a Western reader, you see the word bamboo, this is a plant that grows in Asia. So this is a cultural or geographic reference that does not need any translation apart from direct translation. But south of Yangtze, now this one's tricky. So I looked back to the original Chinese, and there's 2 characters I could read here. South of Yangtze is from Jiangnan. Jiang means river, Nan means south, but this refers to the Yangtze River, which that's its Chinese name is Chángchéng, which just means long river. So it's got that Jiang character in common. And south of Yangtze or Jiangnan it can mean literally all of China, which is south of the Yangtze River. But more specifically and more accurately, from as far as I'm aware, it refers to a particular region of China, just the more immediately south of the Yangtze area. So Jiangsu province, Zhejiang province, Anhui province. And it was a region which was particularly kind of fertile. It's a rice growing area with a temperate climate, which through Chinese history produced a lot of culture, a lot of poetry, was more wealthy, more comfortable, not a northern barbarian region, not a southern tropical region. And it seemed like in his writings, Zhu Zhu had some affection for Jiangnan or south of Yangtze, but this is something I'm going to ask Dong Li about when I talk to him, so watch this space. Anyway, the next cultural reference, rice wine. So I think as Westerners, we think we know what rice wine is. We think it's sake or perhaps soju, the Korean one. What we maybe aren't aware of is Chinese rice wine is a thing called baijiu, which is incredibly strong and it's like more fire than vodka. So even something like rice wine, although that seems like a very simple translation, I think someone I'm not trying to sound snobbish here, but if you know what Chinese rice wine is, if you've just read about it in translated fiction, you might think it's just the same as sake, but if you get the chance to try baijiu and you haven't before, for curiosity's sake, give it a go. Tao Yanming, I believe, so this was a name who might mean something to people with Chinese as a first language. It might not. I honestly don't know how well he's known, but he was listed as a footnote. So there was a little asterisk or 1 after Tao Yanming, and then it tells you below Tao Yanming was a in the Qing dynasty. So names can be a big thing because who you know as a name in one culture is not the same as the other, especially something like the Chinese culture, which has thousands of years of history and has lots of different provinces, lots of different people. Yes. So the last cultural reference there is Orion. So this is a piece of Western culture. This is from classical Western culture. And you, as a Western reader, you don't necessarily know what Zhu Zhu wrote here, because a translator might have Zhu Zhu might have written a Chinese constellation, and Dong Li, the translator, might have thought, oh, Westerners will never know what this is, so I'll convert it to a Western equivalent, Orion. But we can assume here, because Zhu Zhu has made so many other references to Western culture, he's probably written Orion, and Dong Li's probably translated it directly. And thankfully, because this is a bilingual version, if you were really being anal and wanted to know, you could match up the characters in the Chinese page with the word Orion on the English page and see if it's a direct translation. I was not careful. I was not picky enough to go back and check, but you certainly could if that was the kind of thing that sparked joy in your soul. So a word on the very final poem in this collection. It's one that is one of several tributes in The Wild Great Wall to figures from Chinese literature and history. It's called It Comes to Me That This Is Nalan Xingde. Oh my god. That it comes to me that this is Nalan Xingde's city. So for someone who's not an expert like myself, just reading this poem was really educational because it prompted me to Google Nalan Xingde, who is he? And I learned that he was a poet from the Qing dynasty, which was a quite a long-lived Chinese dynasty, and the final one. And it's an interesting one because the Qing leaders were not ethnically Han. They were kind of an invading ethnic minority who conquered Han China. They were the Manchu ethnicity, and Nalan Xingde was a Manchu himself, which kind of placed him in a superior position in the imperial hierarchy. Not that there weren't, I think in the Qing dynasty there were plenty Han Chinese who were right up there, And Nalan Xingde was also up there, but he was from the ruling ethnicity, the formerly northern barbarian Manchu. So anyway, Nalan Xingde, he was a guy who wrote Zi poetry. Zi is a form of Chinese poetry which followed certain forms. There were lots of these different forms, and they were called Zi Pai. And Zi poetry titles, according to Wikipedia, the title of a Zi poetry poem doesn't have to match the content, but what they do often do is express desire. And I don't know if it comes to me that this is Nalan Xingde's city is a poem that uses Zi, or if Zhu Zhu is using Zi Pai in it. And I would say that the title of the poem does match the content, but an interesting thing to bear in mind here, I'm just going to read one stanza from this poem, and then I'll kind of close up this section of the podcast. So here we go. When we wanted to cross the railings and embrace something, it would disappear. Ah, fated witness, were rare baritone. Only he could break centuries of silence. Even his journeys to border passes were not to fight battles, but to bring back vastness and desolation to poetry. So, closing note here, I think what Zhu Zhu perhaps might see in this guy, Nalan Xingde, is poetry for poetry's sake, not for, the glory of battle or for the pride of your nation, but to, he says here, bring back vastness and desolation, things that sound possibly negative. But it's poetry for poetry's sake, even if it is vast and desolate. It's alive and it's beautiful. Right, so hope you enjoyed my terrible poetry readings. Now we're going to pop onto an interview I did with Phoneme Media's assistant editor, Yesenia, who helped bring this episode about by agreeing to give me the PDF proof of Zhu Zhu's poetry collection. So I just took the chance to ask her some questions about the company and the book, and without further ado, let's hear our little chat we had. Oh, and I'm going to preface this by saying I was pretty tired when I did this podcast, and I'm also just a very awkward human being. So there's points where I come across like an alien from outer space. I apologize for those. I think it was still a good interview anyway, and big thanks to Yesenia for doing it. It's very awesome of her. So let's get on with it. So, exciting news, everybody. We've got Yesenia, or Yessie, that's just what I'm going to call her, Yessie, here on the line from Phoneme, the publishers of The Wild Great Wall. So, hi Yessie.
Hey.
You're the associate producer with Phoneme Media, that's right, isn't it?
Associate editor, yeah.
I'm sorry, it's late, my brain's not working. Yeah, the associate editor.
You're fine.
Yeah, so is there anything you'd like to tell us about your company, first of all, and the kind of fiction that you guys publish, or the kind of fiction, or literature rather. Sorry, my brain's really not working.
So we are an LA-based company, started around 2013, 2014, and the entire mission behind us is literature and translation. So we, publish from all sorts of languages, but we try to put an emphasis on languages that aren't really represented in an Anglophone market. We have a lot of novels translated from, say, French or Spanish, and we do those languages as well, but we've also done, Hebrew, we've done Lingala, we've done indigenous Mexican languages like Zapotec, and so that's very much at the core of our mission, trying to bring stories that otherwise would have a hard time breaking into the English market and trying to bring them to readers.
That's cool. So you could see I was tripping up there on whether to say fiction or literature, because the book we're doing today is poetry. And although I've looked at the book covers of your company's list, I didn't go nosying to see what's a novel, what's a poetry collection. Do you have any particular, or does the company have any particular leanings to any particular form?
We've ended up publishing a lot of poetry just because it's pretty convenient to try and do, bilingual formats that way.
Right.
But yeah, we've done graphic novels, we've done fiction. I mean, we're open for submissions now, and we're getting some memoirs as well. So, we're really open to all sorts of literature.
Right. So if any translators or writers of non-English languages are listening, then they could take that as a little plug right there, right?
Oh, yeah. Shameless plug. Go to phonememedia.org. Look at our guidelines. Always happy to take submissions.
Cool. So I'll probably start asking some Wild Great Wall specific questions now. The first one, and I have an inkling of what the answer to this question might be based on what I've read online, but how did this particular publication come about? Is there a grand story behind it, or is it more of a mundane affair?
This was actually just a couple months before I joined the company.
Okay.
So I've been with them for almost a year. And from what I know, translator Dong Li, based in Germany, and came across Zhu Zhu's work, translated a couple of his poems for, just journals, and eventually that became this manuscript, this collection of, just Zhu Zhu's poetry over the past 20 years. And that got pitched to us. We loved it. I particularly love all the imagery that it gives. Yeah. And so, now we're here.
Cool. So how much of the formatting had Dong Li already worked out, and how much of the current product is kind of the work of Phoneme? Do you know?
I don't exactly. I know you're going to be interviewing him as well, so he can probably give you a better answer to that. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So next question kind of leans into that. Have yourself or anyone else in the company had any in-person contact with Dong Li or Zhu Zhu himself, or has everything been kind of remote, like how we're talking right now?
Yeah, so the original pitch and everything that came across remotely, and then we're actually going to be hosting Zhu Zhu in LA later in May. So just bringing across a couple of bilingual readings to the city. We've partnered with China Week in order to, try and get the largest audience possible here. I haven't met Dong Li in person yet. It's been almost entirely remote. Oops, sorry, let me mute that. Okay, I'm back.
Okay, cool. All right, so I think that's that question answered there. So here's another chance for you to plug the book. Where's the book, or where are you aiming to have it distributed, and are there any particular kind of readers you're hoping to reach? Any pre-existing groups of readers or new readers or whatever?
So I guess the good thing about just where we're based, LA, is that you have, over 120 languages represented in this city alone, all sorts of consulates, obviously diaspora groups. And so San Gabriel Valley, Chinatown, all of that gives us a pretty good Chinese diaspora. And so we do reach that audience, people who want to know what's being published right now in their home countries. But also, we just have people who maybe they've got into the whole literature and translation scene through one of our earlier works or another diaspora work, and they just, pick up the thread and go with it. So really get readers from all over the place. And it's been really nice to see how poetry especially has been picked up recently in the past couple of years, how it's growing and there's more of a scene for it.
Yeah, I noticed, or rather, I was thinking as I was reading just how well the poetry collection works as a bilingual book. Although it does, for its front cover it's English. But I was thinking, who would I recommend this book to? And yeah, I would probably, if one of my Chinese friends saw it and saw the cover, and they weren't comfortable with English, they might think it's not for me. But of course, if they looked inside, if I remember correctly, the Chinese poem will be on the left page, the English is on the right. So technically the Chinese is coming first. Do you think Phoneme...
And we've gotten plenty of... sorry.
Oh, no.
We've also gotten plenty of, people who are maybe learning one of the languages.
Yeah.
Maybe they're still learning English, or maybe they're trying to pick up Chinese, things like that. And bilingual editions really allow you to, strengthen yourself on both of those fronts. So also proud to do that.
That kind of made me think, would Phoneme ever try to sell the rights for these books to be published in other companies, or would you ever try and get this book distributed with a Chinese cover in China or something, one of your other titles? Or is that...
I'd say we're open to that.
Yeah.
I mean, we very much chose to be a non-profit and not, not a for-profit company, because we really want to devote ourselves to just getting these stories out there. So it's always, if there's an offer for distribution, we're always happy to consider.
Interesting. Okay, so speaking again about the left page, right page format, so obviously the copy I read, I think I will, by the time we get to this interview in the podcast, I will have discussed this, but you guys gave me a PDF proof just to save on mailing costs. So although I knew the Chinese pages would be on the left and the English would be on the right, it was a proof. It was a PDF, so I was scrolling down through the whole thing on my laptop. But that's the preface to a question. Does Phoneme ever publish anything ebook or ebook-ish, or is it on the cards? Or are you going to stick to print?
So we have a couple of our earlier works up on Kindle, and we're hoping to, as the company grows, get more of our works on there, just, for accessibility. You're right that it's been a problem, especially with international mailings. Most of our distributors are here in the U.S. And so, for instance, our most recent book was a book of Kurdish poetry. We launched that in Iraqi Kurdistan, but if you say you're in Europe or Latin America and you wanted that, then we'd be mailing it from the U.S. And so ebooks are, clearly important for accessibility, and we're trying to get that done. But so far it's been, 4 or 5 of our earlier works on there. So you can look to have that from us in the future. Okay,
interesting. Next question I've got. So in our previous discussions, I think a book was mentioned, but I wasn't entirely certain. So my question is, does Phoneme have any plans for more translations from Chinese further down the road?
Yeah, so we're going to be releasing Raised by Wolves, a collection of Chinese poetry later this year. And I know we had it set initially for a May launch, and I think it's been pushed back to June just because of some issues with the proofs. But so yeah, you can probably expect that from us this summer.
Okay, and don't tell me anything you're not allowed to, but is this going to be a collection from one author, or is it going to be multiple authors?
It's going to be one author.
Okay.
But that's about as much as I'm going to leak.
Oh, okay. I'll not probe any further, but it sounds interesting, especially the wolves part. Makes me think of like the north of China, maybe Mongolia, or Inner Mongolia. Sorry. Okay. Second to last question. This is a tricky one that has a flouncy academic term in it. So, preface to the question: I noticed when I was looking through the Phoneme list of books, there's one called Uyghur Land about by a guy from the Uyghur ethnic group, and although the page on the site didn't use the word China, it did use in the author bio, it used the name of that province in China where the Uyghurs live, Xinjiang. So I suppose whether or not that could be categorized as a Chinese book is up for debate, but would you consider anything actually no, rewinding back a bit, I noticed that the subtitle of the Uyghur Land book had the word exile in it, and exile, I think, is, from what I could gather,
Uyghur Land, the farthest exile.
The farthest exile, thank you. And in the Wild Great Wall, there was also quite a theme of exile. I used Control and F and saw the word popped up 6 times. So do you think, given that there's the theme of exile and there's a Chinese connection to both books, do you think this is the academic term, do you think they're in dialogue with each other at all? Or do you think they're quite separate entities?
It's interesting because with Uyghur Land, you have it translated from both Uyghur and Arabic, and that's both things that, people aren't going to immediately associate with China.
Exactly, yeah. So,
in a way, I do think it kind of represents this movement to show, a multifaceted country, an incredibly diverse country. And similarly, with the Wild Great Wall, you have a lot of writings from Zhu Zhu when he's in Beijing, but also Zhu Zhu when he's in Venice or he's, elsewhere. So
it's like a very continental book, that one.
Yeah, so I think very much this next generation of Chinese writers, obviously they're writing from home, but a lot of them are writing from outside and still giving this impression of, the Chinese experience. So in a way, I could say they're kind of in dialogue there.
Yeah, I mean, there's trickier political questions there, but definitely an interesting angle, especially the exile thing. Okay, I think this is my last question. Yeah, last one I've got on my little document of questions anyway. So this one's another one about phoneme. So on my course, my publishing masters I'm doing, we're on the finances side of things now, and all through the course, we've been learning about the differences between the big five publishers and small and medium sized publishers, and the kind of hardcore not survival, kind of sink or swim economic situation smaller companies find themselves in, and also like how profit seeking and ruthless some of the bigger ones can be. So that made me wonder, does being a non-profit company ease the kind of financial pressure on phoneme or increase it? Because on one hand, you're not obliged to make a profit, but then on the other hand, I suppose revenue streams aren't the same as, your average publishing company.
Yeah, so I mean, this is definitely not something I can, do as a full-time job. I actually...
Right.
I freelance journalism, and I work at a communications company, so officially on taxes, that's my earnings. And so phoneme is very much a passion project, and you'll see that reflected in a lot of our team. Our head editor, he as well does like freelancing and other things. And it just comes back to, it's not like the most profitable company, but we are able to fairly pay our translators and authors, and we are able to distribute, and we're able to keep a lot of creative control over the process, which is, that's very crucial to us, especially when you see languages that have, maybe been persecuted in their home countries because they have a status as a minority language, or authors who, otherwise face political issues at home and have trouble publishing abroad because they don't write in English, and we're able to fill that gap. So it's been very rewarding. And yeah, I'd say the nonprofit side is pretty good because, for instance, when we have another book coming up, we might be able to partner with a consulate or diaspora groups, all sorts. So we find support coming out from all over the place whenever it's a new book coming out.
Yeah, cool. So one more question that popped into my head when you were talking about LA. So preface to this one is I was down in London recently for the London Book Fair, big publishing event, and nice. I took the chance. There was like an event after that at the Guanghua bookstore in London's Chinatown. So a problem Britain has that America perhaps doesn't to the same extent is we have one mega city, only one. It's London. It sucks everything in. It has all the cool stuff. And if you're from somewhere a lot further north like me, it costs an awful lot of money to go there. So on one hand, I was thrilled that in the world of Chinese books in the UK, there's this amazing bookstore. But as far as I'm aware, it's the only straightforward, there are collections and community centres and this and that for Chinese fiction in the UK, but there's one trade bookstore. It's in London. That's it. Yeah. So the question I was wanting to ask was, in the run-up for promoting the Wild Great Wall, have you come across any awesome resources or groups or bookstores, particularly for Chinese and Asian books in LA? Because I can imagine if London's got good stuff, LA must do too.
Yeah, I mean, that's the wonderful part. We have, all these like diaspora pockets. We have Koreatown, Chinatown, little Bangladesh, everything. And within them, it's still very diverse. And so you might find, a Salvadorian bookstore in Koreatown, a Korean bookstore in Little Tokyo, and like that. One of the ones that's been really helpful to us has been the Poetic Research Bureau in LA's Chinatown. Okay. So it's partly a book resource, but it's also a good event space. They're actually going to be hosting one of Zhu Zhu's readings in May.
Oh, cool.
And it's been very useful for, bringing together all sorts of audiences. Our Chinatown is actually right at the intersection of downtown and Olvera Street, which is a traditionally Mexican area. So you have like this really good melting pot of audiences, and they're all able to converge here and just like learn all sorts of poetry.
Aye, fantastic. And I don't know if you would know this at all, but do you know if and again, it's not like there's one set answer given what a diverse city it is, but do you know if the predominant form of Chinese in LA is Cantonese or Mandarin? I'm guessing probably Mandarin these days.
Yeah, especially in the San Gabriel Valley, you'll have a lot more Mandarin speakers, so like that 626 area code. Within LA's Chinatown, the older crowd is actually mainly Hong Kongers, so we have some Cantonese.
Yeah.
And now we also have, people coming in speaking second generation Chinese, so they've grown up in maybe Singapore, or some of them will come in from, London.
Yep.
And they'll move to this Chinatown. All of that.
Oh, the lines are busy. Well, how long have we gone on? It's been 20 minutes. That's about what I was aiming for. Don't want to take up too much more of your time, and I want to unwind because it's been a busy day for me. But thanks so much for talking, Yessie. Thanks for giving such great answers to the questions. I'm sure the listeners.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm sure that was a really interesting thing for the listeners there. And hopefully I'll be able to talk to Dong Li and we'll be able to pop him on this show or a wee bonus episode.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Yeah. Toodaloo. So there you go, guys. You got to hear me try and speak to another human being rather than just a microphone, and clearly I have some things to learn, but hopefully that was an interesting conversation for you all. So we've just about reached the end of the show, some closing notes here. So I mentioned that Dong Li article in World Literature Today. I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. I'm also going to pop in a link to our Patreon and the Phoneme Media website, and of course my Instagram, Phoneme's Instagram. And Instagram is a great, you should be on Instagram. It's cool. And if you follow the Translated Chinese Fiction podcasts, TRCHFIC, you can find out what's going to be in the next episodes, because I won't always tell you on the podcast. You got to make an effort at your end. But most important thing, if you enjoy the show, you do not have to give us money on Patreon, because we all need our money for paying our rent. But you could certainly subscribe to the show, leave reviews on iTunes, you could share it with your pals, spread the word, share links. All of that is so appreciated. So just to remind you of what you can do on Patreon as well, if you give me $2 a month, I will give you a shout out on your internet profile, whatever you like. $20, you can tell me any translated Chinese book, we'll do an episode on it, guaranteed. Until there's too many for me to do, then I will retract and be stingy. But for the meantime, 再见, and thank you all. Bye bye. 人民路有我的好心情，今天就像一封写好